Okay, so my first question for you today is, why is the Hyksos so enigmatic? Why is it that scholars frequently disagree on the chronology of the Hyksos, and even when their pharaohs reigned? What is the solution to this problem in your view?
The expression Hyksos is a Greek rendering of Hekau Chasut, which means rulers of foreign countries. And this terminology is used sloppily all over, since more than a century. And formerly, very romantic stories were invented about the Hyksos. And for this reason, this expression still receives a lot of interest. The truth is that the expression Hyksos originally, or Heka Chasut, originally applies to all foreign princes, not only in Asia, but also in Nubia. And it is only from the late Middle Kingdom onwards that Heka Chasut or Hekau Chasut, the Hyksos, became a terminology specifically for princes in the Near East. But in the Egyptian historiography, this term is used only for the 15th dynasty, sometimes also for the 14th and 16th dynasty, but this is considered as a mistake. The most recent research was able to specify correctly who are the representatives of the 15th dynasty and who are the representatives of the 14th dynasty. Both dynasties were of Near Eastern origin, of Western Asiatic origin, most likely Western Semitic speaking princes. And sloppily, this terminology, the Hyksos, is also used for their people, for the people who stand behind their rule. Now we are able to differentiate, number one, between the 14th dynasty, which is the first foreign dynasty which ruled Egypt, and the 15th dynasty, which were the Hyksos proper. And they both dynasty originated from Western Asia, but there is quite a difference between them, and also, it seems, between the people. I can explain this more elaborately. We have investigated in the last 6 years the question about the origin of the people of the Hyksos. It's more difficult to investigate the dynasty itself because we don't have any human remains of neither of the 14th nor of the 15th dynasty. Nobody found their royal tombs. The 14th dynasty and their people are Western Asiatic origin, and came to Egypt already in the late 12th dynasty, which means in the Middle Kingdom proper. Around 1850 BC, we witness at the site of el-Dabca a major immigration of Western Asiatic people. They cluster around the old town of Es-Bedroshti, where the Egyptians lived and continued to live, but they brought with them their own architecture, their own burial customs, their own ethnic items such as the dress, the Western Asiatic dress with toggle pins keeping together the robe, and also they buried their children only in amphorae, in Western Asiatic amphorae of the Middle Bronze Age, although in Egypt these containers, the Egyptians had much better suitable containers which were more breaking resistant, but they continued to bury their children in the Canaanite amphora. Yes, they settled around the Egyptian old town at Es-Bet-Rushdi. It was a harbor town, and this explains that the prosperity of this town in the future. It was a town which was situated in the reach of the sea, about 30 kilometers from the Mediterranean Sea at the time. And this is very important because during spring, from March until June, the Nile shrinks to 1/5 of its original capacity. And in this period, Nile navigation was not possible or hardly possible. So in order to upkeep a harbor which can send seagoing ships into the Mediterranean, you need a harbor which is in reach of the sea when the nearly empty Nile channels are filled with Mediterranean waters. This is very important. Therefore, harbors for seagoing ships, the most important harbors of Egypt, are all near the sea, but not at the sea. This unique position of Avaris was important for its future development. Egypt was largely an inland culture, and for their expertise in navigation, they depend on immigrants from the Levant, what is later the Phoenician coast. From there came their mariners. We know this from representations from the Old Kingdom already, from the representations from the temple of Usakaf and Sahura. They show ships, seagoing ships, which are manned by Western Asiatic people who have a very specific coiffure, long hair, a headband, a specific kilt, and they were imported by the Egyptian crowns, most probably from Byblos, which was the oldest town with whom the Egyptian crown had direct connections. So in the Middle Kingdom, it seems again that the wish to build up a navy depended on the import of people from the Levant, from seagoing Levant, and also the import of timber to build ships was at the same time maintained by close relationship to Byblos. Now to the 14th dynasty. The 14th dynasty may have originated from dignitaries which were already installed by the Egyptians during the 12th dynasty, the so-called Prince of Rechenu. We have evidence of the Prince of Rechenu from the time of Amenemhat III onwards, which is second part of the 19th century BC. And we have also evidence of a Prince of Rechenu in the time of the 13th and the 14th dynasty from seals. Now, Rechenu is a toponym which embraces the whole of Lebanon and the northern part of Israel-Palestine. Far too big to be controlled by a single monarch. So therefore, we concluded that the Prince of Rechenu was an honorary title bestowed by the Egyptian crown on the leading dignitary of el-Dabca, the site of Avaris, the later capital of the Hyksos, but we are still before this period. We also have now an impression of a seal of the so-called green jasper workshop, which Dominique Colon, one of the leading experts of the cryptic art of Syria, localized at Byblos. Now we have such a seal, and this seal bears the name of a prince of Reggenu, and he has a name which is like a name of a prince of Byblos. His name is Ipishemu, and there is a Biblian prince, Ipishemu Abi, which means my father is Ipishemu. We don't pretend that our prince is the father of the prince of Byblos, but these names repeat within a family in the course of time. And it shows that the prince of Reggenu, whom we have found in el-Dabca, belonged to the, most likely, to the family of the princes of Byblos. This is very logical because the material culture, the imports we find in el-Dabca are mainly at that time around, we are now around 1700, from the region of Lebanon. We can prove it by petrographic analysis of imports, of imported ceramics, but also the whole appearance of the material culture and of the burial customs looks as if they come from this period, from this region. But it is more difficult and more complicated. Suddenly, with the time of the 14th dynasty, we have monumental architecture which didn't exist before. We have monumental temples of Near Eastern typology. A broad-room temple, a very big broad-room temple, one of the biggest in the whole Levant. Its nearest parallels are in northernmost Syria, at Aleppo, at Al-Alach in particular, later also at Hatzor. But these temples were dedicated to the Syrian storm god, Baal-Zephon or Hadad, maybe his name was at the time Hadad. And we think that this temple was also in el-Dabca dedicated to Hadad. So this means Near Eastern religion was introduced to the Eastern Nile Delta with these immigrants, which we may call for convenience sake Canaanites. But we also have a bent axis temple, and bent axis temples in the shape we have it in el-Dabca, consisting of three very specific elements. They exist only in northernmost Syria again, in Ebla, in Tel Brak, and in Assur. Therefore, we think that decision makers in Avaris who decided what kind of temples should be constructed were at least inspired from this region, but they may also originate from this region. With these temples, we have access to the decision makers, which means the decision makers are near to the dynasty. And it means that the dynasty may have had elements of the Hurrians, in non-Semitic people who lived north of the Euphrates in the region where we find these bent axis temples, except Ebla. But this is only, we cannot prove it 100%, but it shows only that the Hurrians are not out of our consideration concerning the origin of the 14th dynasty. We are still speaking of the 14th dynasty, the first foreign dynasty in Egypt, which seems to be, according to their names, mainly of Western Semitic origin, at least their names. Well, later we also studied very thoroughly the burial customs and the imports, the material culture, but by strontium isotope analysis, which was conducted by the University of Bournemouth, which joined our ERC Advanced Grant, we found out that in the pre-Hyksos period, in the time of until the 14th dynasty, including the 14th dynasty, around 80% of the people were not born in the Nile Valley. And from the Hyksos period, 56% of the people from which we were able to obtain samples were not born in the Nile Valley. So in the Hyksos period, the population became semi-sedentary. But we have to be cautious about it because the sample amount is not very large because it's very difficult to get in Egypt the permission to take human samples. These are old samples which were exported already before these very severe conditions were imposed on foreign expeditions in Egypt. Well, now some words about the 15th dynasty, the Hyksos. Many things changed with the beginning of the Hyksos period. The Hyksos period can be recognized in the stratigraphy of el-Dabca by absolute changes in the material culture, in the pottery. There was now a strong impact of Egyptian influence suddenly, what is interesting, because before the inhabitants of the time of the 14th dynasty resisted to Egyptian influence by their burial customs. They buried donkeys in front of the entrance. They buried goats in front of the entrance. What does it mean? That they may partly originate from a society of caravaneers, which went with donkeys at long distances, and the goats were practically the mobile provision for these caravaneers. I mean, this is our interpretation. Maybe somebody who is clever may find a better interpretation of this evidence. The burial of donkeys continued also in the Hyksos period, but only early in the first half, and then it stopped. What is interesting is that many things changed. For instance, also the building material changed with the Hyksos. Hitherto, everything was built of sandy bricks except the tombs, which were built of mud brick. From now on, all buildings were constructed of mud bricks, which are more water resistant. We don't know if this goes along with the change of the climate. This could be a more humid climate, but anyway, it is evident that with the beginning of the Hyksos rule, the building material changed. Many other things changed. For instance, there was no tin available anymore. All metal objects now were produced of pure copper. Obviously, trade connections with the Mediterranean, with Turkey, with Anatolia, with countries which produce or exported tin were blocked suddenly. We also notice, and this is what my colleague Karin Kopetsky and also Sarah Villain found out, that the imports from the Levant dropped dramatically already late in the 14th dynasty and continue to do so until the end of the Hyksos period. Why? We can explain this. in the 14th dynasty, we have evidence that royal Egyptian tombs and tombs of the elite were robbed in the Memphitic necropolises and were exported to the Levant, particularly to Byblos again. In the tombs of the kings of Byblos, we find objects which were originally belonging to Egyptian kings, Amenemhat III, Amenemhat IV. Particularly these two kings, their tombs seem to have been robbed, but not only the tombs, also, for instance, an obsidian box, according to Karin Kopetsky, was stolen from the temple of Atum in Heliopolis, because there is an inscription on this box. It was a whole box of obsidian with golden embellishments on it, with inscriptions. And according to these inscriptions, originally this was an ex voto for the god Atum in Heliopolis. How this box came to Byblos can only be explained by robbery, tomb robbery, and also the robbery in temples. And this explains why in the memory, not only of the Hyksos, but also of the 14th dynasty, which was somehow identified also with the Hyksos in the memory, that they conducted misdeeds. They plundered the country. Not only precious things were exported, which were found in the royal tombs 1 and 2 in Byblos, but also in other royal tombs in the Levant, such as Katna or Ebla. You have objects of kings, also of the not only of the 12th, but also of the 13th dynasty. All this was robbed. How can we prove that? In el-Dabca, we have a necropolis, and in this necropolis, in a tomb where 3 ladies were deposited, we found necklaces, 2 necklaces, and also a pot of hematite, which only appears in tombs of the elite, but the necklaces are precisely of the same typology as from tombs of princesses in Dahshur, which Jacques de Morgan found in Dahshur. And these were, in our case, in el-Dabca, these were tombs of middle-class women, not of princesses. And this is one proof that in the time of the 14th dynasty, these elite tombs and royal tombs were plundered. But also in the palace, we found the palace of the 14th dynasty, at least dating to the 14th dynasty. And in this palace, we found the alabaster lid of an ointment jar with the name of a princess of the Middle Kingdom. It seems to be a princess of the 12th dynasty. This is the second proof, besides the objects which were found in the Levant. Also statuary were stolen and exported, but a lot of statuary was also assembled in Avaris, and this statuary was plundered from temples, from tombs. And it is interesting that about 50% of the royal statuary of the 12th dynasty was found in the later Ramses town, but evidently with inscriptions, with usurpation inscriptions of the kings of the 15th dynasty, of the Hyksos. So it's very clear that in this time, the Hyksos continued to plunder and assemble such costly objects in their capital and try to sell it because it seems that the golden objects were exhausted already. And so they sold, obviously, statuary which were found also in Ugarit, in Tel Hizin in Syria, but also in Hatzor. Unfortunately, in most cases, in secondary positions, because such statuary was constantly reused and reused. But it is very clear now when this statuary were stolen and when the statuary were exported. Anyway, with the Hyksos, many things changed. And who were the plunderers? This is a very interesting question. The plunderers, we have a hint. In the subterranean system of the pyramid of Sesostris III, a very powerful and important king of the 12th dynasty, the predecessor of Amenemhat III, whom I already mentioned, in his underground system, which Jacques de Morgan, the first excavator, found graffiti showing Asiatic people with their typical mushroom-shaped coiffure, which we know also from statues in el-Dabca, mushroom-shaped coiffures. And it seems that it were Western Asiatic people who penetrated this subterranean system and plundered the pyramid, and they left graffiti of themselves, as they couldn't write and couldn't make visitors' inscriptions or what they like. Anyway, who were these Western Asiatic people? One could muse if they were from the Delta, from el-Dabca, but we don't think so. There were also, according to papyri of the 12th dynasty, found at El-Lahun and published by various authors, particularly Ulrich Luft. There were papyri mentioning Asiatic settlements, which were called Wenet, or in plural, Wenut. It's an old expression which appears already in the Old Kingdom, and this has a classifier of a fortified settlement. We believe originally these Wenut were settlements of soldiers, which were used by the Egyptian crown already in the Old Kingdom, but the Wenut were also mentioned in this papyri from the 12th dynasty, so around first half or middle of the 19th century BC. And I think it is more likely that the Asiatics, who were originally mercenaries or soldiers of the Egyptian crown, and in the period of the 13th dynasty, when the rule and the control of Egypt by and by was dissolved and went down the drain, they start to plunder. They knew much better than the inhabitants of Avaris where costly things could be found. And I think it were them who plundered these royal necropolises and elite necropolises. And we believe that the radical change in the material culture of Avaris, which happened with the beginning of the 15th dynasty, could be explained by by new people moving in. Avaris enlarged from 100 hectares to 250 hectares, and maybe even more. And this can only be explained by an influx of more Western Asiatic people. But they didn't come from Asia directly. They came most likely from the area of around Lisht, where you have these Western Asiatic settlements, Wenut. And an old excavation of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Lisht exposed a part of a settlement. And in this settlement, which was restudied by Felix and Dorothea Arnold, my dear friends and colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum or at the German Archaeological Institute in Madrid today, they published new records from these old excavations from the Metropolitan Museum, and it became clear that intramural burials were performed there, which is an un-Egyptian habit. But also a lot of Western Asiatic imports were found there. But also at necropolises nearby, toggle pins were found, which no Egyptian would ever wear. This is the dress code of Canaanite population. And I believe strongly that the changes which we witness in Avaris with the beginning of the Hyksos period could be explained by an influx from Middle Egypt, where at the same time, as my colleague Felix Arnold found out, at that time, the settlements meant that Lisht, for instance, stopped to be settled, and in Tel el-Dabca, the settlement was enlarged considerably. From somewhere these people must have come from. They were more Egyptianized than the population of the 14th dynasty, and they seem to have mingled. But this change in dynasty seems not to have happened without violence. The palace of the 14th dynasty ended in a conflagration. And this is a sign that the transition from the 14th to the 15th dynasty did not happen without violence among these Asiatic people. Well, this is a short survey of our findings.
I know you also talk about in some of your other works that something to do with the Hyksos ruler Salatus. There are some scholars that believe that Salatus was Pharaoh Sheshi, but there are others that point out that Sheshi and his scarabs has no iconography or any symbols in his scarabs connecting him to a Hyksos, and he is not regarded as a Hyksos king archaeologically.
Well, we have two different kinds of sources about the names of the Hyksos. Number one, we have the Manethonian tradition in epitomes in later epitomes, which were transmitted to us by different authors. Excuse me. So these names are corrupted and very difficult to identify with names which we have from monuments. From monuments, we know there was the Hyksos Apophis. He appears also in the Manethonian list. We have the name of other Hyksos kings. We found ourselves a Hyksos with its full titles, the Hyksos Sekaher, but the door on which his name was found in secondary position of the 18th dynasty. But Sekaher was without doubt a main Hyksos. And my colleague Thomas Schneider, who is a professor at the University of English Columbia, he interpreted this name as a Western Semitic name, meaning Sikru Hadu, memory of God Hadad, Hadu. This seems to be a very likely identification of this name, but we cannot identify him with any names of the Manethonian list. He may be Salitis, but in this case, the name was horribly corrupted. Another name known from monuments is Chayan or Chian, the Hyksos Chian, and we even have from a stela found in Tel el-Dabca the name of the eldest king's son, which could be a title, but most likely it was a real son. His name is also mentioned, could be identified among the names of the Manethonian list. Anyway, Khayan, there is a name in the Manethonian list, Pachran. He could be Khian, but this is a guess. We don't have a firm connection. So thus far we have the names Khian, Apophis, and from the Turin papyrus, Hammudi, the last king of the Hyksos dynasty. This and also the succession seems to be intact. Whereas from the Manethonian list we have Saritis, Bnon. We also have Apachnan. We have Apophis, Apophis, who can be identified with Apophis. But we have three other, throne names of Apophis, which are, according to the general Egyptology, seem to be only changes of the same king. He lived for a very long time because the mathematical papyrus Rind is dated into the 33rd year of this king. And then we have this Hammudi, and we can only identify Hammudi as the last king according to this fragment from the Turin papyrus. And he must have reigned 11 years because on the reverse of this mathematical papyrus Rind is mentioned the 11th regnal year, but the king is not mentioned, but it must apply to this Hammudi, because there is no other possibility, because these entries at the reverse of this papyrus were entered in Avaris. It is very clear that these entries on the reverse of this papyrus were entered in Avaris, because it was mentioned that the great one from the south, who was for sure Ahmose, he took Sayala and the fortress of Sayala, and anyway, negative omina are mentioned, which herald the taking of Avaris.
So the Hyksos kings have cuneiform names. Which culture do you think they most likely came from? I know that some scholars think they might have been Amorites, or these people over there, Mesopotamia, or those people over there. What do you think?
Well, Amorites, Canaanites, these are names, of course. These were Western Semitic people. It is most likely that the major amount of the people behind the Hyksos rule were of Western Semitic origin. We also found some new evidence of Western Semitic officials, but this doesn't exclude that there were some of the decision makers may be of Hurrian origin. This is not yet finally settled. The Hyksos themselves, as I said, the Hyksos dynasty, they seem to originate from from a dynasty which settled for a long time in Egypt itself. And we witness in el-Dabca a culture which is partly Middle Bronze, Western Asiatic Middle Bronze Age culture, with their own pottery, with their own burial customs, with their own types of temples. We even have a cylinder seal cut locally, which shows the Syrian storm god Baal-Zephon as patron of the sailors and as the overlord of the sea. He steps on top of a snake, which is the snake Yam, the god of the sea, and So it is no doubt that Western or that Syrian cults were established in Egypt from the late 12th dynasty onwards, latest from the 14th dynasty onwards. So their culture was mixed. They were partly acculturated, but partly they took their own heritage with them. And the heritage was intramural burials, donkey burials, goat burials, burying children in amphorae, not in other containers, having a Western Asiatic dress, a toggle pin, having the mushroom-shaped coiffure, at least in the time of the 13th dynasty. Of course, no coiffure is preserved except in statues which were found in Tel el-Dabca from the pre-Hyksos period. So you can imagine a kind of acculturation, and the Egyptians had a strong part in it because, for instance, Papyrus Rind, the mathematical Papyrus Rind, but also other papyri seem to have originally been kept in Avaris, literary papyri, and this can only be explained by strong Egyptian community, which continued to live at Espet Rushdi, in the old town of Espet Rushdi, which was in the northern part of Avaris, where there are no intramural burials, where no toggle pins were found, no children burials in amphorae. And it seems that this Egyptian community survived the immigration of Western Asiatic peoples throughout the Hyksos period, and they maintained the Egyptian scribe culture for their overlords, for the Hyksos. This is the only explanation of the evidence.
So do you think that Salitis and Sakrhar are the same king?
It is a possibility, but the name Salitis is a corruption. All Hyksos names are corruptions except Apophis. And no other Hyksos name from the Macedonian tradition can be identified with, securely. But we have ideas, of course. I personally think that Sakrhar was at the beginning of the Hyksos period, and that who was Benon, we don't know. Apachlan, I think, was the Hyksos Chayan, and Apophis is Apophis, and the last king, Hammudi, is preserved in the Turin royal papyrus.
Why do you disagree with other Egyptologists that concluded that Pharaoh Sheshi, Mayabri, and Salitis are the same guy?
Well, it is an interpretation which may be followed or rejected, but it is not an evidence. And if the scarabs of Sheshi really belong to the 15th dynasty, is also a matter of debate between Kim Ryholt in Copenhagen and Daphne Ben-Tor and other and other experts in this field. For instance, Maurice Weinstein or Ilin Tomich from Mainz.
What do you make of Josephus's analysis of Manifu? Because when he looks at the Hyksos, he came to the conclusion. Now, I understand Josephus's writing like 1,500 years after the fact, after the Hyksos era ended,
Yeah.
but he makes a very strange comment that a lot of scholars talk about, and he says that he thinks that the Hyksos unworthy Jews of the Exodus story. What do you think about that?
Well, I have published several papers on this in this respect. The appearance of the Jews in world history is much later. It's 500 years later. The archaeological evidence produced reasons to believe that the settlements, which can be associated with the settlement of the proto-Israelites in Canaan, happened only with the beginning of the Iron Age, which means with the beginning around 1200 BC. Before that, we have no evidence of proto-Israelites anywhere. And at the same time, it's interesting that the prototypical house, the so-called forum house, which appears everywhere in the Judean lands and also in the Negev at the same time, appears also at the same time in Egypt, in Thebes. And we believe that these were temple slaves which originate from a campaign of Ramses III. Ramses III, who lived early in the 12th century, and he made raids in Edom and in this region, and brought back a lot of Shosu Bedouins, and we believe that some of them may have been proto-Israelites. This is the earliest archaeological evidence. Of course, some Bible scholars have very different ideas. They date the Song of Deborah much earlier, but I'm an archaeologist and I believe in solid evidence. And the solid evidence is that we have only the first settlements of proto-Israelites from, let us say, around 1200 BC or shortly before. We have also the earliest mention of the name of Israel at the famous so-called Israel Stela of Merinptah, which dates at the end of the 13th century BC. So we have no firm evidence of the presence of Israelites, neither in Egypt nor in Canaan before that.
Do you think that the Hyksos story at all could have influenced the Exodus myth?
This could be. I will explain you how, but let me explain why the Hyksos have nothing to do with the proto-Israelites. I don't say this only because of the enormous distance between the first appearance of proto-Israelites in Canaan and the Hyksos rule in Egypt, but the Hyksos had an urban culture, and the Hyksos were adherents of Canaanite cults, particularly of Baal-Zephon and perhaps Asherah. Anyway, they were adherents of an urban culture, and they were living, they had their own architecture. They brought their urban life. They brought with them intramural burials, whereas whatever we can learn from the proto-Israelites, there were no intramural burials. They were a culture which seems to originate from a pastoral ancestry. And also the Bible itself, it is normal that people in their sagas present themselves as victorious, and they present real stories. I mean, stories of, not real stories, but stories of greatness. This is not the case with the Bible. They were slaves in Egypt. They had to work hard. They were humiliated. This sounds quite realistic, and it is not a story of a victorious or grand past. So therefore, I believe that the pastoral ancestry of the proto-Israelites has a genuine background. It's also, I mean, the mentioning of tents, living in tents, the mentioning of tending cattle, pasture, I mean, sheep, goats, I mean, all this speaks in favor of a pastoral ancestry. I know that some colleagues whom I highly respect are of a different opinion. They believe that the proto-Israelites descend from the Canaanites in Canaan, but this is very difficult to prove.
So what is the chronology of the Hyksos kings? How long did they rule? Who were, like, in chronological order, who was first? And I know that you said earlier that Halmudi or Kamudi is the last one.
Yes.
If you could expand on that, that'd be great.
Well, firstly, speaking about the absolute chronology, there is a controversy now if the 108 years, which were originally read in the Turin papyrus about the duration of the 15th dynasty by Giulio Farina and also Jürgen von Beckerath, this score was doubted by Kim Ryholt, and recently also some scholars came forward with a much longer duration of the time span of the 15th dynasty. I would say the time span of 108 years is a credible unit. Why? Because it fits in the general chronological parameter which we have from the New Kingdom and from the Middle Kingdom. And if we prolong the Hyksos period for 50 years or even more, then we come into trouble. So, of course, some colleagues claimed, because imprints of Hyksos scarabs of the Hyksos Hayan have been found together with imprints with bulle of the king Sebekotep IV of the 13th dynasty, that these dynasties overlapped strongly. But this is it is very well known that scarabs are used much longer, especially royal scarabs are used hundreds of years later, and therefore this kind of it's a very one-sided interpretation of the evidence, which is hard to believe. We ourselves think that the original reading of 108 years by Giulio Farina without question mark, it was published without question mark and was verified by Jürgen von Beckerath, a very eminent Egyptologist, that this is a correct, a credible duration of the Hyksos dynasty. So far about absolute chronology. A problem is the end of the Hyksos period, because the mentioning of the end of the taking of Avaris in the tomb of Ahmose, son of Ibana, who was a leading naval officer in the campaigns against the Hyksos. It's difficult to date this event within his narrative. So it could be, it is believed generally that the taking of Avaris by King Ahmose, the founder of the 12th dynasty, of the 18th dynasty, happened late in his reign, because there are spearheads in the Pushkin Museum of Moscow, which are Western Asiatic spearheads, and the names of Thutmose were engraved in a version which only appears late in his reign. So therefore, it's believed the taking of Avaris happened late in the reign of Thutmose. Of course, one could suggest a different interpretation, that these names were cut later or something like that. But generally, it is believed that the taking of Avaris happened only late in the reign of Thutmose, after his 18th year. So he reigned about 25 years. So this is about the taking of Avaris, let us say in his 18th or 19th year. And from that, you have to calculate backwards, let us say 108 years. And then you arrive to about 1640 BC, which is a credible date. If you add 50 more years, you end up with 1690 BC. Other authors, other scholars try now to calculate the duration of the so-called Second Intermediate Period with the help of genealogies of leading dignitaries in Egypt, in Upper Egypt, and to come to a credible solution about the time span of the Second Intermediate Period. But if you start the Hyksos period already 1680, 1690 BC, you run into certain troubles from the point of view of archaeology.
Final question. Oh, go ahead. You weren't finished.
Yeah, anyway, because, for instance, in el-Dabca, we see a very strong trend of a change with the phase E2, which is a major phase in el-Dabca. I mentioned already the very eminent changes. And if I calculate now the whole time span, let us say from the beginning of the settlement in el-Dabca till the beginning of the New Kingdom, I come with all the phases at our disposal to an average period of 30 years. Even if I subdivide this, I come always to the same score. If I take only the 12th dynasty, I come to 31 years. If I take the 14th, if I add the 14th dynasty in my calculation, I again come to 31 years. And if I take the whole of the Hyksos period, I come to 31 years about. If I take the beginning of the Hyksos period till the end of the reign of Horemheb, we again come till the end of the reign of Amenhotep II, I again come to the same score. Why? This is the average, is very near to the average of a generation. And it seems that after one generation, the building structure was changed. And so the traditional date of the Hyksos period makes sense. Of course, you can doubt about it and find other explanations. I wouldn't rule that out. But I came to the 30 years, 31 years, not by taking the generation first and calculate afterwards the chronology, but vice versa. I took the distances, let us say, from the beginning of the 12th dynasty with the beginning of the settlement in el-Dabca, with the end of the settlement of the 18th dynasty about the reign of end of the reign of Amenhotep II, but I even can extend it to the end of Horemheb, who also built a fortress there. And I always, if I cut these time spans into units, or if I take the whole time span, I always get as a result 30 years, and this 30 or 31 years. And this time span applied to the Hyksos period with a traditional duration of 108 years makes absolute sense. So much about the chronology. Of course, we can say the absolute dates are not valid, but nevertheless, we have the relative chronology, and the Hyksos period appears only with the phase E2. My previous calculations have been firmly supported by the study of the scarabs in Tel el-Dabca by Alexander Ilin-Tomich from the University of Mayence, and he found out that scarabs from the Hyksos period only start with the 15th with phase E2. Scarab, the only matter which disagrees with me is that scarabs of the 14th dynasty also only start with the Hyksos period. But this does not contradict to the dating to our dating of the 14th dynasty. The scarabs are missing. I mean, that's it, as simple as that.
Final question. You've been bringing up earlier about the Hyksos using the names or naming some of their some of their kings being named after Hadad, the storm god in the canon. Since Hadad is recognized by scholars to be a later version of the Sumerian god Ishkur, the storm deity, would you say this is the primary or supreme deity of the Hyksos?
I think so. Now, let us speak about the storm god. The storm god, the Syrian storm god, was Hadad, and the Egyptian storm god was Set. And Set was first mentioned to be the god of Avaris by King Nehesi, one of the first kings of the 14th dynasty. King Nehesi is known from an epithet, beloved by Set, the lord of Avaris. And the classifier was the Set animal. But if we go now to the 19th dynasty, to the famous stela of 400 years of Ramses II, the god Set there is presented as the father of the fathers of this dynasty. And he doesn't look like the Egyptian god Set. He looks perfectly like the storm god, with horns, with a long Near Eastern crown, with a long pomon hanging down from the crown. He wears the Syrian kilt with tassels. And on top of this, he wears the Egyptian gown, but the transparent gown. This is the Syrian storm god, which in the Interpretatio Egyptiaca of the time, he was identified with the Syrian storm god Set. And but we have already evidence from the end or from the late 12th dynasty that Set and the Syrian storm god were already the one and the same in the eyes of the Egyptians at that time, and also in the eyes of the Near Easterners. For instance, in Sidon was found a seal, a scarab of a prince of a toponym called Ia, beloved by and this is only shown by the Set enamel, the Lord of Ya. This means that, it was found in Sidon, and the land of Ya is also known from the Sinue story, and it's a toponym of the northern Levant, most probably from the Lebanon. And this means that Ya and the Set animal was a classifier of Baal, or of Hadad, the storm god, the Syrian storm god. Also, Neve Alon from the Metropolitan Museum in an important article published in our journal Egypt and the Levant, proved that Set and Baal, in their meaning, in their move together, originally, Set lost his very negative connotations in the late 12th dynasty or in the late Middle Kingdom, and acquired more positive connotations which he got from Baal. The storm god. He was respected. And last but not least, we have these inscriptions of King Nasi of the 14th dynasty, who was beloved by Set, the lord of Roachet. This is one toponym, and on a statue found at Tel el-Muktam, but originally coming from Avaris, he is mentioned as beloved by Set, the lord of Avaris. Now we have again the Set is the father of the fathers of the 19th dynasty. And Piramesse, the Ramses town, was founded practically at the same place as Avaris. All these meanings together, if you combine all this evidence, it seems very clear that Set and the Syrian storm god were, at least in the Delta, considered one and the same divinity, and that there was a continuity in despite that Avaris was captured by the Egyptians, and there was a cult continuity from the 14th dynasty till the Ramesside period. And the Ramessides seem to originate, according to the titles of Paramesse, the later King Ramses I, and Seti. According to their titles, they originate probably from the Delta, because they have high military titles related to the Eastern Nile Delta. And it seems that they constructed the ancestry from this storm god in the Eastern Delta, which they called Set, but who had the appearance of the Syrian storm god, with a cult continuity from the 14th dynasty till the 19th and 20th dynasty. And this is remarkable. And these 400 years mentioned on this stela could have been the remote connection between the stay of the people, the Proto-Israelites in Egypt, which is specified in the Bible over 400 years, because somehow the presence of a Western Semitic population in the Eastern Nile Delta and the tradition of a Western Semitic population in the Eastern Nile Delta was still remembered in the Ramesside period. But this is all. They were not the same. Another kind of evidence of the appearance of Proto-Israelites to Egypt are toponyms in the Wadi Tumilat from the Ramesside period. In the Wadi Tumilat, we have at least 4 toponyms, Semitic toponyms, and it is strange that Egyptian scribes used these foreign Western Semitic toponyms instead of Egyptian toponyms. And this can only mean that this area was settled by a Western Semitic population. But the evidence is only from the Ramesside period. It's very likely that in the Wadi Tumilat were survivors from the Hyksos period, but this is hundreds of years before, and maybe some memory of these settlers were still remembered in the Ramesside period. But it's very clear, for instance, from the Papyrus Anastasis 6, that a troop of Shosu Bedouins arrived in the Wadi Tumilat in the late 19th dynasty, asking to water their herds and to pasture their herds in the Wadi Tumilat. And the Egyptians granted them this, and according to this papyrus, it seems that this was a repeated affair. They got the permission to stay at least for some time there. But you can imagine that some time could also be permanent by and by, and that the Wadi Tumilat was settled more or less by generations of Bedouins who came during times of drought to Egypt to survive with the herds. And it's interesting that, and perhaps no coincidence, that this happening mentioned in the Papyrus Anastasis 6, although it is a scribed letter, that this happening dates approximately to the same period when you have the first time the name Israel mentioned in the Stela of Merinptah.
Do you think that Set and Hadad were the same god, or were they just confused for the same god later?
I mean, throughout ancient Egypt, the merging of religions was done again and again within Egypt, but also with foreign gods. And in this case, this merger happened with a foreign god. Which became very important due to the Hyksos period and their predecessors, the 14th dynasty.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.